Plain Truth, the show where we go into some of the mysteries, anomalies, and the dirty underbelly of the world around us. I'm your host, Paul, and joining us this week, we have Catherine Austin Fitts, who really needs no introduction. She's quite well known in the alternative world of different things, such as economics and technology. Catherine, are you there?
Yes, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, we appreciate you coming. It's our pleasure. And along for the ride is my friend Sibel. Sibel, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I'm glad to be here.
Well, good. Let's jump into this show with what's going on these days. Catherine, when you look around, what just as a light intro, what do you see going on in the last few months that kind of stands out that we might want to talk about?
Well, what I see happening is integration. I see more and more people learning how to connect different parts of the financial system and the governance system. And we're coming to a point where, it's almost like a group of horses being herded into a into a canyon. We're racing around looking for the exit. And what I see is more and more people coming to the basic understanding that that the system is centralizing control, and we need to ask the question, who's really in control here? And I see a much deeper, wider understanding of the real system and how it works. It's pretty exciting.
So to kind of go with that old saying, then maybe people are starting to wake up, so to speak.
Oh, I think there's a lot of waking up. It's interesting. I just ordered a new book called, I think it's something illusions. It's material illusions, something like that, by a stewardess, and it's a fictional book, but it's based on very detailed research. She was a flight stewardess for 30 years and has very deep knowledge of the airline business, and it was based on very serious research, apparently, into 9/11. It was recommended by a subscriber. And I listened to an interview before I bought it, and she said, I knew that the official story was complete bunk, but I was still flying, and I just couldn't face it or deal with it. And so I started to research after 2004 and, came to these conclusions and finally wrote the book. So it's now 2015. 14 years later, and she's just now publishing what's supposed to be a very interesting book, fascinating book on 9/11. And I think, so she's been conscious the whole time, but it takes a long time to digest and change your, think of it as a very deep change in your fundamental operating system. And now she's ready to say, I'm completely alienated from the establishment, enough so that I'm willing to publish a book that's saying, that the official story is a bunch of bunk. And I see a lot more people. It's been very interesting watching the U.S. Politics, both abroad and domestically. What I see is more and more people saying, the old tricks just aren't working anymore. We understand the tricks, we see them, they're not working. So I see a lot fewer people being patsies, even though they're quiet in their way of withdrawing. There's a very significant withdrawal from the establishment, is what I see. If you look at we posted several months ago a poll was Reuters doing it or AP doing it with the academic institution, a poll about Americans' confidence in institutions. And I think the corporate news media, the TV media had a 9% of Americans said they had confidence in it, and 7% said they had confidence in the news. And if you look at the support for all the different institutions, the military was the highest with 50%. I think you got down to 23% for the Supreme Court, and you just kept getting lower for the administration and Congress. And so what it was saying, and I think large financial institutions were even lower than corporate media. So, essentially what it said is, other than the military, Americans have absolutely no respect or confidence in their institutions. Pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, I wonder what that would have been like 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
Oh, much higher. Much,
Oh,
much higher.
I'm sure it was. I mean, actually, I'm originally from D.C., and so kind of have a little bit of perspective on that. I think things have totally changed, but on the other hand, so many changes have been from one half of the divide and rule agenda to the other half. You know what you know what I mean? They've been very tricky at getting it so people get emotionally involved in bashing one president versus the next one, that kind of thing.
Well, part of the thing is if you look at how the system is operating,
Hmm.
it's really cutting into the core. And I've seen we just published the annual wrap up, which we do every year, and then I just did the first quarter wrap up. And in the process of that, for about a year, I've been trying to understand what's happening in education and Common Core and testing and some of the other things coming along. And it's taken me about a year to kind of get my beat on it, if you will.
Hmm.
And I've looked at many different things, as you guys know, and Common Core and what's happening in education is the ugliest thing I've ever seen. Of all the things that the pro-centralization team has done, this is the worst. And I think most people in education don't realize exactly what the end game is and where it's going. But essentially, if you look at what's being done in healthcare and in education is essentially one vision, one plan. And what it will do is it will completely wipe one of the few remaining areas of local economies that are healthy. Because what you're doing is you're standardizing whether healthcare or education so that you can make it very easy for the software to innovate. So you're standardizing people so software developers can have a field day and engineer all the equity values into their companies and their stocks, but you're going to completely wipe out significant amount of employment both in healthcare and in education and essentially privatize it all into corporations. But it's not a market economy plan because you're going to mandate that citizens or taxpayers pay for things they don't want, or they're going to be forced to buy from people they don't want to buy from, which is, you're talking about creating forced monopolies and doing it where the person paying really has no say. It's kind of the opposite. It's very Soviet.
Yeah. I think you can practically, feel the hammer and sickle there, and not the good side of communism. I mean, totally the bad side. I have a friend who's a doctor, and he thinks that there's really a push to, I guess you would say, uh, make everything ticks on charts, and so that things can be outsourced, and there'll be a
Right,
new kind of doctor. It won't be a doctor. It won't even be a nurse. It'll be essentially an analyst of tick marks,
right,
and this can be sent to India or the Philippines or whatever. And they really want to make assembly lines out of medicine.
right.
And this, of course, from his point of view, would be a disaster because basically, no matter what software you use, it's not something that you can look at on paper. You have to look at the patient.
Right.
So that's kind of what I see on that, is that they're going to do exactly what you said. They're trying to make a kind of a mass system out of it.
Well, I think it's worse than that. Because, if what you're doing is you're setting up the educational system so that it can be owned and operated by corporations,
Hmm.
and you're engineering it so that large corporations and intelligence agencies can have direct access to children, their thoughts, their actions, their words, everything piling into their databases without the intervention of teachers or parents or doctors. So, and you're doing it in a system where, most of those kids will be engineered to fail. And the ones who quote unquote succeed will be highly, robotic and perfect to help you run your monopolies.
Well,
I
there's
thought
a quote.
they were
Go ahead,
testing
Sibel.
they were testing on attitudes and people's personality and natures as well as, math and whatnot. So they've got all these personality testing on who people are. And, with schooling, they can manipulate people's attitudes and personality and, whether they're going to be bold or whether they're going to be passive or whatever. And then they have mass data on the public of who people are. It's crazy.
Well, here's the thing. The problem, there are many problems with it. But if you're a parent and you allow your child to go into the Common Core system, there's a 100% chance that your child will not be competitive up against a system coming out of a free and open system. So, or a child coming out of a free and open system. So, if I'm in Outer Mongolia and I have internet access, I can get on the internet, find for free the best curriculum in the world, dial into Khan Academy, and help those children just learn, as fast as they want, and end up with a love of learning, and they will be remarkable, and but they will not be bogged down with 25,000 hours of wasted time and curriculum and paying of student loans and everything else. And here's the reality: if you want your kids to succeed, you can't afford to spend that much time and money doing things that send them in the wrong direction.
I met a father who was homeschooling his daughter, and she got a B in math, but she was like 7th grade, and she tested like 4th grade in math. And he's like, how can she have a B? So, well, she's in the top 20% of her class, is how she got a B. But then he started looking at the actual curriculum, and he said they extended this between the different steps. There was like 75 pages of extension of a step, adding, subtracting, multiplying. And he cut it all down to the actual steps without extending them and boring her to death.
Right.
And 3 months later, she tested at 11th grade.
Right. I mean, here's the problem. If you send your kids into the Common Core system, they're going to be intellectually, harmed or destroyed, and they're not going to learn what they need to be successful in the world in the way it's going.
Hey, Catherine, taking this a little to a different level, though, what concerns me is, okay, the people in charge of these systems, what are they thinking? What is their game plan for 10 or 20 years from now? Because if you have a country, or broadly speaking, the Western world, that's been dumbed down, and you have Asia where, it's just incredibly vital now, active, and people are trying to get their kids to study, private academies and stuff. Obviously, you won't be able to compete in normal senses. Your workers won't be up for the task. So,
well, but
are we looking at, like Bill Joy's article, the future doesn't need us?
In
a sense, that with automation,
yes.
is the game plan that they don't need us?
In a sense, yes. In other words, they would rather replenish their system with eager young people from China than with Americans. So, I just think they apparently think that these folks are not necessary. I mean, that certainly is what it looks like, because you're talking about destroying the intellectual capital, or certainly the majority of the intellectual capital of the next generation.
Well, we've had empires in the past who essentially like to rely on a constant refresh of talented immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't be anything new. Because, for one thing, as a minority, they wouldn't be able to challenge the ruling political class. Right? If, for example, the U.S. just said, from now on, all heavy lifting, intellectual heavy lifting is going to be done by Indians and Chinese. Well, it would take forever before the Indians and Chinese would number and be organized in such a way that they could overthrow the ruling system we have. Whereas if the people living in the U.S. now got organized, they could overthrow it quickly.
Well, part of it's that, but I think, there's several things going on. It's not either or. But the reality is, if you look at what's happened over the last 50 years, the majority of people in the United States do not, they do not have the attitude and skills to make them really productive in the workforce up against educated immigrants. I mean, that's,
That's pretty clear.
Yeah, and so what you've done for the last 50 years, I mean, the dumbing down process started a long time ago. And so, for example, it was very interesting. Sibel mentioned my driving around. When I started driving around in 98, people looked very different than they do now after, 15 years of genetically modified food. And you will literally walk into communities in the rural areas where 15 years of processed and genetically modified food, and people look and walk and talk as if they were zombies. So you're talking about, the dumbing down process has happened for a long time here, and it's created in many places a population which is, angry, they're alienated, and they're not healthy.
Yeah. And again, though, what is the thinking at the top? Because when I visit the U.S., that's what stands out. Everybody looks sick or whatever, unhealthy.
Right.
That's the thing I noticed most. And it doesn't look that way when you go to other countries. It doesn't look like that in Turkey. It doesn't look like that in, wherever, Colombia.
I'll never forget going to a conference in Mexico, and all the Americans were standing in line in the hotel to check in, and the Mexicans all looked so healthy, and the Americans looked just like they were, they'd been eating formaldehyde for 30 years. It was really scary. It's pretty scary.
Well, but again, we get back to what does Mr. America or Mr. Global, think he's doing? And then, of course, what should we be doing? So,
well, I think Mr. Global thinks he is managing things in a democratic process. And so he doesn't think democracy works. And so the question is, how can you switch the system by first giving people, overwhelming them with consumer choice, which makes them feel powerful, while you're diminishing their political choice. And then after you've gotten them, to the point where you've pulled all the political levers and power away, then you really throw the switch and sort of cut the subsidy you're spending, giving them all these wonderful consumer choices. So think of it as a coup d'etat, but very slow moving.
Yeah, well, it does feel like that. When did Pinochet take over, or something like that?
Right. Well, I'm gonna be the bad guy, and I always am, because in '98 I left Washington and really tried to engage with different people and communities on how we could turn it around. And one of the reasons you can't turn it around, or we haven't to date, is the corruption at the local level is as serious as it is in the Washington and Wall Street level. The corruption is, all the way from bottom to top and back down again. And the reality is, at the local level, this is all being engineered and enforced by people who are willing to do it for a very small amount of money and very, minor prestige and position.
Do you think it was different 40 years ago?
Yeah, I do, because I think the local guys had much more control. And I think the other thing is, if you look at how the pro-centralization team operates, they're very good at operating invisibly, and their technology allows them to be very effective invisibly. And the average American can't fathom that technology exists. So in the first quarter wrap-up, I use an example of how a family is harvested financially by the financial system, and I describe how the local financial institution harvest them, then the credit card company, then the local marijuana dealer, then the car thief, then the used auto dealer. All these different parties are just gouging and harvesting them as they sort of go through the process of being liquidated. And what they never realize is that all those different parties are drawing from a fairly centralized relational database operation.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the one way, what Glenn Greenwald has described as the one-way mirror, so very invasive digital technology that has been used to suck up data and aggregate data to give very detailed pictures on individuals, households, and places, and they operate. The way they operate strategically is on harvesting places. How much money can we make out of this place? And how much can we drive our stock values up harvesting this place? And they're very, I saw it when I first moved to Tennessee. I just couldn't believe the way the system was working me. I live in a county with a modest income level, and I was just stunned at the talent that was calling me on the phone, working me, assuming that I was just another person here in Tennessee. And, of course, I had the knowledge and skills and background to really understand what was going on. And I've negotiated with the meanest Washington and Wall Street lawyers, so I'm trained. But I thought, if you don't have that training, you don't have a chance up against these people. It was, because I have been the target of so many different sort of entrapment games by credit card companies or mortgage servicing companies, and I've seen a wide variety of what's going on. We created a machinery where the big banks could make more money from people's failure than they could from their success. And so when a lender can print money out of thin air and make money from your defaulting, it's a big problem. Anyway, so.
Well, it seems to me, though. Oh, go ahead, Sybil.
So, in the past, the masses were the golden goose by being workers and paying taxes and such. And a certain amount of care needed to be taken care of the golden goose, to have them still be able to be productive and, not rebel. So, but now it's a completely different game. How are we the golden goose now, and what do they need from us?
Well, here's how it flips. So it's flipping in a couple ways. After World War II, we created a pension fund system, both Social Security and state and local and corporate pension funds. And what we said to people is, okay, you're going to work, and a certain amount of money is going to go into these funds. Well, that money, every year we put another dollar into their pools, and those dollars were used to finance the rise of multinational corporations. So we were coming into the point where we were going to retire, and part of what I think the 1995 to 2007 shenanigans was all about was getting the value out of those funds before we suddenly came along and said, okay, well, now we want our money back because we're ready to retire. So by that time, they had filled the pension funds with much more of the funny money that had been issued during that period. And it was a way of basically saying, look, we're going to get the money out of here before you guys spend it all on nursing homes. So think of it this way. When you're putting money in the pool, we all think of that as our money, but they don't think of that as our money. They think of that as their money to go finance whatever they want to finance. And so if we stop putting money in and instead want to take money out, that's not a $1 problem, that's a $2 problem, because they need a new dollar every year. And so if we say, wait, I want to take my money out, they're like, no, I need you to put in another dollar. If you take out a dollar, then I got a $2 problem. And so that's problem number one. Number two is the power of the United States for many decades came from being the largest consumer market in the world. So at the end of World War II, we opened our markets up relatively to the world and said, okay, we're the arbitrator of the Bretton Woods system. We're going to have free trade. Everybody can sell to American. And having that consumer market drove the global economy and gave the U.S. tremendous power in that model. But now we're no longer the number one consumer market. That has moved to Asia. So the Apple Store gets far more downloads at the App Store from Asia than they do from the United States. And we've been surpassed not only as largest consumer market, but largest internet market that's moving away.
So
The ad. Sorry.
What do they want Americans to be now? I mean, just in terms of if we are a resource, what are they considering the most profitable for them way to manage us?
Well, that's the question. But we need to see that two things made Americans feel like they had power, and those two things have flipped. They've gone from 0 to 1. They've flipped. And so what made us an asset 10 years ago makes us a liability now, from the point of view of Mr. Global. So the question, of course, what does that mean they're going to do? If you look at the statistics on life expectancy, if you take a woman my age who doesn't have a college degree, doesn't even have a high school degree, between 1990 and I think 2 years ago, her life expectancy has gone down 5 years.
Yeah, I actually work in healthcare, and my 80-year-olds are healthier than the new 60-year-olds coming in.
Really?
The new 60-year-olds that are coming into Medicare they are closer to death than a lot of my 70-year-olds.
Wow.
They're just much sicker.
Do you have a theory as to why that is?
They had shorter period of good food, and they don't cook. They do microwave, or they eat out. And they didn't work as much. I mean, they don't, I can shake a hand of a man who was a farmer when he was a kid, and he's 75 years old. I can still feel the strength. And I meet a lady who's been on disability for the last 10 years and sat on her sofa the whole time. She can't even shake my hand, much less get off the sofa. And she's going to die before him.
Remember, so particularly starting in the 90s, you wiped out. Well, in the 80s, you started wiping out the small farmers, and then you've done everything you can to wipe out the small business people. And that has radically reduced not only income, but sort of useful, productive skills in many, many people. And so you end up with what you're describing.
So, yeah, I mean, because I see them, they get on Medicaid, so I think that's part of why the Obamacare thing was designed to get more people on Medicaid. Because you've got this, 60-year-old who's been on disability on Medicaid now. Now you can charge, $10,000 a pop for a chemo drug or an experimental surgery that's, $100,000 or a $6,000 wheelchair. Someone's making money.
Right. Right.
So it sounds like America doesn't need as many people. So they're just going to harvest people until people die off? Or what do they need from Americans? What's the minimum that we need?
Here's the question, and that is, we are entering into a period of tremendous automation, both the re-engineering of healthcare and education to do much more with online systems and software that will radically reduce the sort of labor in existing functions. And then we're in the process of introducing robotics. And there are two theories. One is you're going to have significant unemployment. And the second is, no, it's going to create so much productivity that you're going to have, significant expansion of the economy into other things. Now, that only works where people can adapt and make conversions. And traditionally, the way a lot of these conversions happen is you had far more entrepreneurial activity. But it looks to me like they're doing everything they can to discourage that. So I think if I had to guess where Mr. Global is going, is what he wants to do is set everyone up so that he can consolidate all economic activity into monopolies he owns and controls, and everyone else gets a check for $600 and learns to live on that, on a monthly stipend. And there will be healthcare coverage, but not healthcare. So
Yeah.
forget trying to get an appointment, because I'm sure you see people, I call it the 26-step process. You make them jump through the process, but ultimately, you say they have healthcare coverage, but God help them if they have to get healthcare.
Oh, yeah, so you have that benefit, but you're not eligible.
Right.
Yeah,
So I think they want to slowly ramp it down, and as they do that, lower the life expectancy of people who are not useful. And they've got to do that in a way that it looks natural. So it's got to look like the people who are, whose life expectancy are coming down because they had poor habits and made poor choices.
Yeah.
So you always want to blame the victim.
So is the social contract going to survive the slow burn at a minimum, or so how do they keep people from rebelling or, setting things on fire? And
I don't know. There are a couple of questions here, and that is, if you look at the game that's being played, it's wearing thin. It's wearing thin domestically, and it's wearing thin internationally. And a lot of the old tricks that we used to use in the 90s so successfully, they're not working. People are hip to them, and it's happening. If you see what's happening around the Ukraine, and to the extent that Putin is getting support around the world, that's part of it. Or if you look, I just put a blog post up about what's going on in Baltimore. And, I think there's significant disbelief of the official story in Baltimore. And then you have, Hillary Clinton coming out and saying, oh, we need a radical re-engineering of criminal justice. And the whole world goes, here's the game again. It's just more, the riots were engineered, and, it's problem, reaction, solution, and it's all bunk. And what's very interesting is I put up in the blog post a video of her, of her announcement of this sweeping criminal justice reform at Columbia University. There were a lot of seats empty. A lot of seats empty. And what that says is, people are tired of the game.
Yeah.
So I think there's a game that's been used to implement the centralization over the last 20 years, and it's really petering out. Now, what that gets us down to, if you look at the centralization system, it's very economically unproductive. You consolidate wealth in a way that shrinks the pie. It makes the people who are doing it richer at the top, but the pie gets smaller because it's so unproductive. I mean, anything this in violation of fundamental, sort of human spirit and market economics, it kills creativity, it kills innovation. It just, people stop taking risks, they stop trying. And so this has been very, very bad for the economy. It's amazing how well the economy is doing, even considering. And so as you're getting that shrinking in productivity, you're financing it by simply making people around the world take your dollars and your treasury, your treasury securities, and it works because you're the global reserve currency. So keeping the domestic game subsidized, therefore going, is dependent on keeping the international game going. And the question as to whether the U.S., the market share for the dollar has fallen dramatically, as it was destined to do by rebalancing the global economy. So that was a process that was kicked off and expected. But the question is, can the Americans continue to maintain the reserve currency and the lead military power globally? And I will tell you, that is not an economic or financial question. That is a military question. And it comes down to who's got the best weapons, which brings us, of course, to the question of who's got all those UFOs flying around in the sky that are clearly not flying on fossil fuel.
Yeah.
And yeah, so this is a military question as to whether the game can continue, because the domestic game is so uneconomic. It requires the international game to continue to float the subsidy.
So food stamps is dependent upon keeping the dollar reserve? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then what's going on in China and Russia, there's this new banking system that the U.S. isn't involved in? I don't.
Right. Well, what's been happening is when Snowden came out with his revelations and Greenwald, and they got publicized, you had a reaction in the BRIC nations to say, oh, something, these systems have no integrity. We need to build our own systems, whether they're internet and digital communication systems or payment systems or clearance systems, and we need to be able to transact without going through the dollar. So we need to be able to, build currency swaps and interaction. Now, I think that ultimately what's happening is, you started a process in 1995 where basically the United States tried to build out a global empire leading towards global governance, and the U.S. is stalled, in many different fields for a variety of reasons. So they're sort of pregnant halfway, stuck in the mud, everybody mad at them, and it wasn't getting done. And I think if you look at what Snowden and Putin and the BRICS are up to, actually, I think that's Mr. Global deciding that the U.S. needs a little competition, and we have a better chance of getting to a global currency and global governance with through the Hegelian dialectic, if you will, of competition between Plan A and Plan B. And, so I think it's leading generally towards the same place. But what happened was the IMF came forward with a restructuring that would have allowed the BRICS a bigger say in the IMF, bigger participation. The U.S. has failed to approve that plan. Congress won't do it. And so the IMF, very disappointed, is sort of licking their wounds, trying to figure out what to do. And meantime, the Chinese announced an Asian infrastructure investment bank, which makes perfect sense, because if you look at the infrastructure plans and needs, they're extraordinary, and we can't just sit around and wait for the IMF, and who wants to depend on one institution anyway. And what happened was the U.S. took the position no one should join it, and I think given the refusal to re-engineer the IMF, many of our allies just said, life goes on. And I think what you're seeing, and I come back to international and domestic, because I think there's the same thing is happening in both places. You have too many people understand we can't eat food unless we grow it. And the U.S. thinks that it can run around the world and just make mess and destroy and steal and bully and whatever, and people just are sick of it. Because they know we have to, the problem with the economy is we're spending way too much money and time fighting, and, we're spending way too much time using the financial system as dirty tricks. And
Hey, Catherine?
Yeah?
If I may ask, I think a lot of people are curious about this. Do you think we'll have a Cold War where there's basically, let's just say, Eurasia, we'll say Russia, China, and most of the countries in between on one side, and then the Anglo-American system on the other? Putin, in his State of the Union speech, basically said that's what many in the West wanted, but he's not going to give it to them. And that could be all posturing and theater, but what is your take on that? Do you think we might actually be heading into blocks?
I don't know, and we're headed into a multipolar world.
Mm-hmm.
We've been in a world where you had one or two dominant powers, and now we're going into a multipolar world. with many players who are not going to be particularly reasonable. It's going to be messy. But again, this all comes down to the military question. And part of the military question is who's got breakthrough energy and who doesn't. I don't know if you guys have seen the Elon Musk's announcement about the Tesla Powerwall today.
No. Didn't see it, just got up.
Yeah, they announced their new product, which is a battery that kind of sits on your wall, looks like a sculpture. That's for the individual home, and then they have another one that's bigger that you can use in blocks for factories and much bigger uses. But they believe they have the battery technology to make solar very efficient. And one way or another, that's coming in the next 5 years. So I think one way, for example, if the U.S. is really in trouble economically, they can pull the rabbit out of the hat with new energy technology. If Musk is allowed to stand up and do that, somebody's allowing him to do it. So that could infuse the economy with enormous productivity if you bring the energy price even down. So there are two big questions here. One is military technology and one is energy technology. And what is the state of play between the United States and everyone else?
And that is another question, Catherine. I think there might be another angle to that, though. I think the angle would be, do they want a Cold War of sorts with blocks? I mean, it's not just a question of how good our weapons are versus how good, let's say, Russia's are. There's the question of, would they be comfortable with that kind of world? And I really don't know, but, certainly those of us who lived through the Cold War can easily imagine it.
Here's the thing. You're thinking of this, starting in January, we started to deal with an unprecedented level of hacking.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you look at where the hackers are, they're coming in from, over 150 locations around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my guess is they're being financed. If I had to make a guess, I would say corporate media is financing, sort of an effort to make sure that independent news doesn't continue to build market share.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is pure business. This is just basic economic warfare. But if you look at by far the dominant places coming in, those hits are coming from Russia and the Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
So, we're not in a world where there is, nation states with one government in each nation state, and we're competing between them. It's very different. I'll give you another example. In 2005, a fairly senior guy from Russia tried to persuade me to basically change sides,
mm-hmm.
and I should join with the Russians. And he was very charming and very brilliant and had a very persuasive argument. But my final comment to him was, "No one likes a traitor." He said, "Well, then you're stuck on the wrong team forever." And I said, "Well, that's the way it is." But something was terribly wrong. So I got home and I did some research and I realized, I wasn't dealing with a country. I was dealing with the second largest owner of Fannie Mae securities.
Well, I agree with that, but I would say that, is that different from 40 years ago in the Cold War? I mean, the West certainly was under a financial oligarchy. There weren't really countries. I mean, I don't really think Denmark and Germany were independent. They were, you know what I mean? If you're occupied by NATO.
Well, I think there's a lot more behind the scenes cooperation between elites than the news might suggest. So, here's the reality. You have $1.7 trillion a year of global military expenditures on the overt basis. The covert, Lord knows how much that is. And that's an extraordinary constituency to keep war and suspicion and distrust alive. If you look at what's driven the U.S. stock market over the last 3 years, it's Obamacare and defense.
Well, that's why I'm saying I view the original Cold War as having been a construct, essentially, a created paradigm, so to speak.
Uh-huh.
And if we had another one, I would consider it to be the same. It would just be a calculation by Mr. Global that that's how he wants to play his hand. Not so much that this was forced because of, whatever. If it's forced by anything, it's the rise of technology that they're afraid they can't control.
Well, here's, what you had. Let's go back to Eisenhower's military-industrial complex warning. Mm-hmm. That complex, when the Cold War was over, we were all expecting the peace dividend. And what happened was, with 9/11, that group whose stocks were going down, suddenly, consumer stocks are going up and their stocks are going down. Suddenly it switches and inverts, and they go to town, and we get, I don't know if you saw the story that the Washington Post wrote a couple of years ago called Top Secret America. We get an absolute explosion of government contracts and government money pouring into this infrastructure, which really has nothing to do. And the scary thing, we now have created a generation of leadership that only knows how to rig things with government money and government credit. They don't know how to really grow, real true businesses in a marketplace. This is what they know how to do. And it's I've likened it to a tapeworm. It's a parasite, and it's growing, growing, growing. And the problem is you can't figure out a way to get it to stop growing other than the collapse of the dollar, which I think is why so many people, are very hopeful that it will collapse, because then at least, you have a chance of saying no to the parasite.
Well, I guess it's a good time to ask if you are still following the slow burn or what you think will happen going forward.
Well, I certainly, for 2015, I think the slow burn, I put the chances at very high, but this year in the annual wrap-up, I divided it between two scenarios for the slow burn. One was called North American Renaissance, and the other was volatile and violent. So I think we're going to see a lot more violence, and I think the thing that scares me is when more and more Americans realize what's going on in education and how it connects with healthcare. You're going to see you're seeing tremendous anger. And I'll never forget being on Coast to Coast, and George Norrie, I was just doing a news spot, and he said, "What do you think's wrong with the economy? Small businesses and hiring." And I said, "Well, George, I'm a small business, and I have no intention of ever hiring anybody else again." And he said, "Well, why not?" And I said, "Because they're spraying chemtrails over my head. You do not want to build more overhead and take more risk when somebody's spraying barium and aluminum over your head. Why would you take risk when somebody's doing that?" So
that's a good question.
Yeah, if you look at, the Fed really believed the economy was going to be strong this year. And I don't see how the economy can be strong because people are afraid. Nobody takes on risk when you're afraid.
Well, then I guess where's that renaissance coming from? If you say there's a good chance of a renaissance, where do you think it will come from? The gradual release of technology?
The North American Renaissance was basically, I think that what I see is the Anglo-American alliance is getting ready to pull into itself. So, it sees the Bretton Woods system unraveling and things becoming much more fractious globally, and you're seeing an insourcing of a lot of functions into North America. So it's a renaissance in the sense of sort of the business and investment world pulling investment, back. Think of the body, when the body's in trauma, it brings blood back into the heart and the vital organs. So I see that as being the Renaissance. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a Renaissance for every part of the population. There are many parts of the population who will not get the benefit of that.
Okay. Well, a minute ago we talked about energy technologies possibly being released.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a huge topic because I think they're already coming out. I mean, all over Asia,
Right.
I think you see
Right.
things. So they're not really free energy, but let's say 50% cheaper energy or something like
Right.
that.
Right.
And then you have things like the batteries and stuff. So would that actually help the United States? Right now,
Yes.
the U.S. has an economic advantage
Right.
versus, let's say, Europe or Japan, because energy costs are a lot lower, right?
Right. Well, it depends on who owns the best technology, and who can implement it the fastest. But there's true right now we have a tremendous energy advantage, and if it reduces our energy advantage, then relatively we're going to be reduced. At the same time, it can add so much productivity to the overall economy that, if you look at what could happen globally, it could be tremendous in terms of productivity.
Well, I just think they must, Mr. Global needs very, very skilled analysts and advisors because I can see this, the best laid plans of mice and men. I can see how they might say, oh, we want to control Russia. We'll put some better energy out there. But it might kill them because, after all, who's paying the energy bill? And the answer is China.
Well, here's the question. What is Mr. Global afraid of? Because my perception is that our leadership is very afraid. They are coming at this from a place of real fear. And a lot of the efforts to have tight surveillance and tight control, that's coming from a place of fear. What are they afraid of?
Well, that is the $64,000 question. I think they're afraid of people waking up, for one thing. I mean, you could argue chemtrails and all that. If you keep people sick, they can't think straight. They can't see what's in front of their very eyes. So there's that. I think also they're afraid of just the natural, call it human karmic cycles. I mean, I think countries rise and fall, groups rise and fall, and even New World Order financial groups rise and fall. I mean, they've had their days in the sun in the past, Venice and all that. And so, in a sense, I think they're afraid of history, so to speak. They're afraid of the natural change in the world.
Right.
So, anyway, that's it's a philosophical thing. But what that means, though, in a more like pragmatic kind of way, would be, I think they're afraid that Russia is providing coverage for China. In 15 years, China will have its own breakaway civilization that can protect itself. And the thing about those Phoenix Lights is, they still get taken out by nukes. You know what I mean? And I think Russia has great technology, and so that's part of the hysteria about Russia. Is it's not Russia per se, it's that Russia provides the alternative countries to rise a bit into the multipolar world. But having said that, I agree the Rothschilds, others may be, simply using it as the dialectic, absolutely. But there certainly must be people in the U.S., or I guess you'd say in Britain as well, who just don't want to give up 90% control and be stuck with 50% control.
Well, the history of giving up control never turns out well, or often doesn't turn out well for the people who give up control.
Right. And that's your question, is why are they afraid? And I would say maybe because moving to the multipolar world, they don't think they can control it as well. They have their game plans, their white papers, but will they really work out?
Right. Well, but it was, when the Cold War ended, it was the West that triggered the rebalancing of the global economy. So this was something we wanted. This was something we led. And once you start it, I mean, if you look at the current numbers, it's if the GNP per capita in India is 6 to 7,000, and 50 to 70 here, depending on which year and how you count the numbers. It was a fait accompli that at some point it would come into parity. So we knew when we unleashed that process that we would end up in parity. And that's quite a remarkable change. I mean, think of it. We're going to have, according to The Economist, by I think it was 2020 or 2025, almost everybody on the planet is going to have a smartphone that has the equivalent of supercomputing power in it. And we're going to be able to talk directly to each other.
Well, yeah, it's already amazing. I mean, traveling around Asia, you see, and Africa too, and Latin America, you see remote villages have cell phones, and if they need to, they share them. Right? A place that doesn't have, a 7-Eleven has a cell phone. Cell phones. It's quite amazing,
Right.
because they are actually that valuable to people.
Right.
They can arrange travel. They can arrange
Right.
ordering things, even in a remote village. So it really is a brave new world of sorts that we've entered. Well, I have a question about the whole breakaway civilization thing. And where do you think, what do you think they're doing? Do you think they want to roll out space technology now? They want to roll out better energy technology?
I don't know. I don't see to me, the most important question is, what is the governance structure on Earth? Who's really governing? How does it work? And I don't see it clearly. And I think the number one most important question is, who are they? Are they human? Or are they from another dimension? Or are they from another planet? I don't think we know. And I don't know the answer to that question. There's a huge enigma and question mark at the top. And the reality is the financial system is simply a subset of the governance system. And until you're clear on the governance system, it's very hard to have a theory on where all this goes. I will say, just from what we can observe around the planet, we are talking about hard evidence of trillions of dollars of hardware and advanced technology, which is certainly not what we're using in the main culture on the ground. And if you look at how much money's been stolen just in the last 20 to 25 years, it's enough to finance an independent civilization. And I will just tell you, after spending a whole life trying to understand what's going on in the financial system, the whole planet is being harvested. It's almost as though we're sending a dividend, out there into space. To me, that's the big question. Where is all this money going? Because the drain is extraordinary, and it's going someplace.
This is a big question I've had. It looks like there's this worldwide harvest going on, or rape. And I find it hard to believe that there is just, a man-made underground system, bases and underground trains and under the ocean bases and stuff like that can really explain it all. And certainly rich banksters with, sports cars in the Cayman Islands, that doesn't even come remotely close to the amount of money and resources we're talking about. So what do you think? I mean, are we missing part of it? I mean, is it going into space in a way we can't see? Or
what I believe is that we've spent significant amount of money on underground facilities and a significant amount of money on space travel and dealing with space. So I think if you go back into the 50s, 60s, and you listen to interviews of people who were involved in building the sort of criminal financial fraud, narcotics trafficking infrastructure for the intelligence agencies, what you hear them say is, look, this was the best of, a couple of bad options. And this was really a policy choice at high levels. And they felt like this was the best of anything they could do. They needed huge amounts of money in secret. They certainly, a lot of rational people believed that it was the right thing to do. So this was, but then it spiraled into something else. And I will tell you, I'll give you an example. I had an incident when I was working in Washington. I worked for a cabinet secretary who's very unstable emotionally. And one time he had a sort of psychotic episode, got very angry at a regional administrator for doing something and basically screamed for an hour or two straight. It was very strange. But the regional administrator said to him, Mr. Secretary, I had no choice. It's the law. I had to do it. And the secretary screamed back at him and said, the law? The law? The law's irrelevant. I don't have to obey the law. I report to a higher moral authority. And at that moment, you literally had what I saw in my mind was a scene. The movie wasn't out yet, but it, sort of like of Eyes Wide Shut, the group in Eyes Wide Shut. And this guy really, and I can give you other stories and examples, but basically that group didn't think they had to obey the law. It was very neocon oriented. And they were just, we're here to reinvent the world and the law's irrelevant. I remember the general counsel of HUD saying in one meeting, he said, I won't use the F word, but he said, F all those guys. Who cares if they have contracts? By the time they win in court, we'll be gone. They just thought U.S. laws were quaint things that, was a mere annoyance, like a mosquito. They didn't have to be bothered because they reported to something far more powerful.
Well, but doesn't power just drive people nuts? In other words, how the inner circle, top-level meetings of Nazis, in 1930s Germany might have been the same. Once you call all the shots, you think you're God or whatever. What does the law matter?
Power drives some people nuts, not all people nuts. There's some who seem to be immune to it. It's interesting. You would watch that, and it was always interesting who could handle power and who couldn't in Washington. But I do think that when the Soviet Union collapsed, we as a nation were very, very immature. We were not yet in a position psychologically, morally, socially to really run the planet as a global empire. And so rather than sort of step up to the plate and say, okay, we're going to lead, we said, okay, harvest time, let's run around the world and play global sweepstakes and buy up as much as we can, as fast as we can. And we were, Joseph Stiglitz gives some very good examples of this. We just decided to exploit the situation and, to the victor belong the spoils. We just decided to have at it globally in a very perverted way. And I think one of the interesting things about the Russian response to us is it's very much a cultural response. Do you know the story of the scorpion and the frog?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think they're just saying, look, you're a scorpion, and we don't want, your culture is perverted and disgusting to us, and we want nothing to do with you. We don't want to be run by corporations, and we don't want to be run by people who are immoral. You disgust us. And the disgust... Go ahead.
There's something about the whole Russian and Soviet thing that, what you said a minute ago is kind of like my thesis, that the U.S. ruling class went nuts after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, the Soviet Union and Russia, starting with Andropov, kind of wanted what they called convergence. They wanted to join the Western club. They wanted to be like, the Europe would become more bureaucratic, so to speak, and Soviet Union and then Russia would become more market-oriented. And basically, let's just put it this way. They wanted to go towards something that Mr. Global would be happy with.
Right.
And it didn't play out. What they got is attempts to break them in pieces and steal everything, the Chechen
Right.
wars and various other things that would take forever to go into. And so that kind of was one of my questions. I mean, why couldn't Mr. Global be nicer at that point to, instead of all stick, why not more carrot to lure, in today's world, I guess you'd say China and Russia. But it's really the whole world. Why didn't they do it in a nice way?
This is a brilliant question, Paul. It's exactly the question we ought to all be asking. Because the U.S. had a golden opportunity, and let's face it, they've blown it. And it's interesting, we had a workshop out in California in November, and Joseph Farrell made a brilliant comment. He said, when Bach wrote his music for a harpsichord, he wrote it on 28 tracks. And if you listen to the U.S. music today, it's one track, it's the drum beat. And if you listen to U.S. discourse, U.S. policymakers, they're talking one track. And they're trying to enforce their will globally, talking one track in a 28-track world. And I think that's a very astute comment. The way they went about the world was, maybe one track is too simple, but they came at it with a 1 to 5 track mentality instead of a 28 track. And they could have ended up far more powerful and much richer if they'd gone at it in a 28 track way. And why they didn't, I can't tell you. And Leonard Cohen has a song where he says, we were blinded by the beauty of they're blinded by the beauty of their weapons. The only hypothesis I have is they were so enamored with what the weapons could do, they thought they could continue to live in a world of simplistic models and attitudes.
Yeah, I mean, my only guess is they thought they had achieved what they wanted. And I think that they had achieved, 90% of what they wanted or something, but not quite, because for one thing, they still had to deal with the rise of Asia. I guess they just believe in violence so much that they thought that once the Soviet Union was kind of on its knees, that nobody could stand up to them. And you've said that in so many places that, truly it's the ability to deliver violence that's the key.
There's China was never the one they were the most afraid of. Japan was always, to me, Japan was the greater threat.
Yeah, I agree. I live here. Yeah.
Yeah, and China, has a real challenge keeping their population employed. Japan has the real engineering juggernaut. China's still way far behind in that way. And so I think, the fear of the United States if China and Japan should ever get together. So, if Russia, China, and Germany should get together, or Japan and China should get together, if the old World War II axis was to get together, that would be the thing that they're worried about. But I think in Asia, they're much more threatened by Japan. And that's why I have very important questions about what happened at Fukushima.
Well, that's a long topic. That was where they did their World War II nuclear bomb stuff. That and Nagoya and what's now North Korea. And a lot of people think that Japan had the first bomb test before the U.S. And anyway, Fukushima is where the uranium is found inside Japan. It's the only place. And they have all these mountains for their underground complexes up there. And so I'm pretty sure that's where a missile program and various other things are. So that right away makes you wonder why it happened there instead of somewhere else. Anyway, that's a long topic, and it's a tough one
Right.
because, you know, I'll just give you an example. In Japan, they always like technical stuff. You know, the newspapers would always analyze things technically. You
Yeah.
know that, right? It's a
Yeah.
cultural thing, right?
Yeah.
And so with earthquakes, you'd always get all these graphs of the P and S waves,
Uh-huh.
right? And you know, analyzing the earthquakes. And they didn't do that at all. It just died, and they don't do it anymore. For any earthquake, like this last one in Nepal, they just stopped. And it raises questions. The P and S waves don't seem quite natural.
Right.
So I don't know. I don't know. That's another one of those questions. Who is running things? Who's calling the shots, and what do they want? Right?
It's
Because you know you could, and even is it an attack on Japan or is it an attack on the Pacific Ocean? You know what I mean? Just all kinds of questions. Do they want depopulation? If you damage the food supply in the Pacific Ocean, you'll eventually put a lot of pressure on the food supply.
right.
So I don't know. But anyway, this question of why the U.S. hasn't been nicer has been a big question to me. I mean, it's almost like it's intentional that we're going around the world trying to unite everyone against us.
Well, I wouldn't say that, the U.S. was immature.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because I was in Washington during that period,
Mm-hmm.
and I saw many people that I had worked with and who I respected. And I have to tell you, it was as though they had become people I didn't even know. They had lost their mind. They,
Mm.
I, it was amazing. It was shocking to me. The hubris was now, and you have to look. I don't know if you've ever read my online book, Dylan Reed and the Aristocracy of Stock Profits.
I've
We
read it. It's
were
great.
we were dropping SWAT teams of federal agents into communities with local police too, and they were rounding up first of all, they were bringing in the drugs, they're bringing in the guns, then they're dropping SWAT teams in, rounding up kids, many of whom were innocent. They cut the money, the appropriations on the public defender's office, so all the kids had to cop a plea. They went to prison. Everybody made money on the private prison stocks, and then the kids sat in prison and made uniforms for the Department of Defense. Now, that is exactly what Hitler did. You round up innocent people, you put them in a slave labor camp, they make uniforms for the Department of Defense. That's Nazi stuff. And I remember going around and around to a variety of people in Washington, Wall Street, and explaining, this is very bad karma. If we do this, then we're next. This isn't going to stop with.
But Catherine, the Nazis won the war. Just kidding. The Germans lost, but the Nazis did okay.
Nazis did okay, but the thing that I still to this day don't understand is there were thousands of friends, colleagues, families who went along. We have an entire society that has gone along with intentional genocide, right next door, right under our nose for decades now. And I don't understand why.
So I kind of have a question about, because you've been watching kind of the male model and even the women who get into powerful positions, they act like men. And how can we bring, in particular, how can women bring feminine qualities to affect what's going on around us, to bring more renaissance, to stop damage in local communities, to take care of it? What can women do, as the globe comes more together, to try and make some things better for people?
Well, I think if this comes down to each one of us, because we have the power to do this if we reach critical mass. But if each one of us will support the people in our lives and in our communities who are authentically, acting in the highest and best interests of all concerned, as opposed to doing the dirty, I can't tell you how much it would shift things, because, crime that pays is crime that stays. And for many, many decades now, I see the people who are doing the crime getting tremendous support from the audience, from the voter, from the consumer.
Well, I think people are very susceptible to greed versus, and the more kind ones, they're greedy for their family instead of just for themselves. But we're getting to a place where we can't just be motivated by greed.
Paul, can I have your permission to tell another story? I don't want to
please.
Okay. So my favorite story, it's up on our website. If you do a search for Karma Means You Don't Get Away with Anything. It's a story from one of Jung's books, and it tells about a patient. Have you ever heard me tell this story on the Solaire Report?
I may have, but go ahead.
Okay, so Jung has a very wealthy patient come and see him. It's a woman, very well dressed, clearly from the aristocratic part of society. And she comes in and she says, I'm not going to give you my name because I'm only going to see you once. And I want to tell you my story. And here's my story. I was, as a young woman, I went to medical school. I was trained as a doctor. And I fell in love with my best friend's husband. And to reconcile the tension, I murdered my best friend. Being a doctor, I knew how to poison her and get away with it. And I got away with it. And sure enough, I married her husband. And from the moment I married him, from then on, everything went wrong. She said, I got pregnant almost immediately after we got married, and then he got sick and died. And I had wolfhounds, and they got sick and died. And I was a very accomplished horsewoman. And whenever I tried to get on my horses, they bucked and reared, and I had to give up. Riding. And my daughter grew up, and as soon as she could, she ran away and never came back. And I don't know where she is. And basically, what the woman explained is that wherever she was, the birds would stop singing. She said the birds knew. And she said to Jung, the reason I've come to see you is I feel like if I confess and tell the story, maybe I can clear it and find a way to go on and have a life because I'm miserable. And, I have to tell you, my feeling is that wherever we are in whatever community we're in, the problem is that the birds have stopped singing for us because the birds know. And what we all have to do is we have to find a process which is safe and productive to come together and confess our sins and to stop acting in ways that make money from genocide, whether it's here in America or abroad. We all have to just do our best to try and shift things, but whatever we do, stop supporting the leaders who are doing this. And if we all did that, it would shift. And it could shift in very positive ways because there are 20% of the population, the people who get up and get the trains out on time and run things, and they don't like this. They understand that ultimately, you need a productive society, and they see how perverted the culture is in terms of where this is going, and they have the power to shift it, but they need support. And right now, so much of the support goes to the people. America supports the winner, and if you think the criminals are going to win, then they are, and we're all going down.
So what's giving you hope right now? When you look around, what gives you hope and makes you see possibility for not just this total dystopia?
Well, I'm very hopeful. And, we have forces of good and evil coming to a head, and it's almost like a detox process. Somehow it all has to come to a head. I'm very hopeful because I've seen, I've been through some very intense experiences in my life, and as a result of that, I've seen spiritual forces at work. And I know they're present, and I know they work. I know the universe is intelligent, and it's full of love. Love is, to me, the only reality. We just have to choose it. And one way or another, it's going to get sorted out. Now, the reality is I believe my soul is immortal. I believe all of our souls are immortal. And this lifetime is just one passage, one cycle. And that's why it's so important in this lifetime to not do anything that compromises your immortal soul. And at a spiritual level, that's what the battle is about. Can they get you to compromise your immortal soul? And we each have to get to the point where we understand that death is not the worst thing that can happen. The worst thing that can happen is you compromise your immortal soul. That's the worst thing, because that's much harder to reverse. So I think there's a battle going on, and I think ultimately, if you look at the spiritual forces, the power of love is so much greater than all the weapons in the whole world. But enough people have to choose love.
About, I guess, a year ago, last March, I talk to my angels sometimes. And I was driving down the road, and I wasn't actually talking to my angels at the time, but I used to, when I was driving, I would talk to them. And I got this voice in my head, and it said, they lost. And what the message was the powers that be lost. Whatever they were fighting for, they'd reached a tipping point where whatever action they took, they weren't going to get what they wanted. And it still all has to play out. But it was just this overwhelming kind of experience. And I'm just watching.
Right. I've had similar, I had an experience in 2010 with a friend that died. And as she sort of passed over, it was like I was in a middle place. And when you see the power of those forces and you realize, if you look at what's going on at this planet as evil, it doesn't begin to have that power. So, and that was the message, the words weren't they lost, but, we've had it. We're cleaning house. Here we come. Get ready. And that's when I realized, I just need to do what I'm asked to do. I don't have to take care of the whole big thing. I never forget, I had a wonderful friend who came home. She converted to Buddhism, and she came back from the ceremony, and I've never seen her look so scared or depressed. And I said, what in the world happened? And she said, oh my God, they just informed me that I'm personally responsible for world peace. How could I possibly? So,
that's quite a burden.
Yeah, it's quite a burden. So, but I do think we're going through, the whole planet's going through a detox, and it's a painful process, but here we go.
Well, that kind of raises the question as to, Catherine, you talk a lot about, parasites and all that, but are there things that live off of parasites? I don't want to be nasty about it, but we ourselves have adjusted to this so that maybe we're addicted to the parasites, so to speak. We're living off a system that can't go on, but we can't make the change so easily.
Right. But I think if we shift consciousness and then shift actions and continue to learn, that there's a pathway through. And part of the reason I believe that is, having studied the economics, what I know is the current system is very suboptimized. If you shift in a pathway which is wealth building, whether it's living wealth or financial wealth or both, the current financial wealth on planet Earth is 1% of what it could be in a reasonable period of time if you just took the boot off. So I'm not saying that the governance issues are simple, but there's absolutely no reason on this planet for poverty.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
Well, Catherine, I think we've had you for a fair bit here. Is there anything we could add at the end? I mean, we can mention your website is solari.com. Any projects, anything you'd like to close with?
Well, a couple things I'd like to tell you about. One is we do quarterly and annual wrap-ups. And part of it is our subscribers are way busy.
Okay.
And trying to sort, we divide the media between three groups. One is bread and circus. So a lot of the corporate media is bread and circus. Then gloom and doom. A lot of the internet, unfortunately, has become gloom and doom. And then what we're trying to be is the space we call free and inspired. And that's how I think of you guys. You're in our space. We share that, we're just trying to find a pathway through and live free and inspired lives. And anyway, so what we find is people are very busy. And if you're going to be free and inspired means you want to know what's really going on, but you want to know it so that you can live a successful life. Help us do the same. And so what we find is people are way busy. And if we can summarize sort of what's going on quarterly and then annually and give them the big picture, it makes it much easier. If they have that framework, then they have a way of sort of sorting out all the news day to day in a way that where they can stay coherent, because there's something about the flow of information that is coming at us that reduces, not increases, coherence. So we're trying to help flip that with those quarterlies, and that's why I sent those to you as background. So I really encourage people who are interested to take a look at those. And we just did an annual wrap-up that's really great, and we just finished the quarterly. The big theme was planet debt, and it's quite interesting, and that's what led me into the big thing on Common Core. But the other thing I wanted to mention is we just had as I go around the country and the world, I try and have lunches with subscribers, and we just had lunch at an old haunt of mine from Wall Street, the 21 Club in New York. And we had 45 subscribers, and Richard Dolan came down and gave an amazing speech. I gave him the wrap-up, and I said, okay, integrate the whole UFO phenomena with the rebalancing of the global economy and what's happening geopolitically. And he stood up and gave a 45-minute speech. And then we had unbelievably wonderful subscribers engage in a round-robin discussion of what's going on in the world. That was the most fascinating, powerful conversation I've ever had, because you had people who, like you, have really studied what's going on and know, and then they're ready to talk about what can we do about it, but they're perfectly, they can think on all 28 tracks. And what I started to see for the first time is the emergence of a leadership group, very invisible, but very powerful, because they can think on 28 tracks, and they're very interested in successful, pathway building to a world that's free. What they all share is a very quiet but passionate commitment to freedom, and for everybody. And it was pretty beautiful to see. And one guy, when he left the room, he said, I always love coming to these things because it's like taking a drug. We all kind of got high on the conversation and the freedom to speak our minds. It was pretty wonderful. So
hey, Catherine,
I see something happening.
You know that sometimes people forget there's an incredible power in, I don't know if you want to call it frequencies working together. How's that?
Absolutely.
Sometimes you can forget it. You're stuck by yourself and, at home or whatever. But 20 people on the same wavelength or whatever
right.
can be a beautiful chorus.
Well, my favorite story in Scripture is the story of Gideon's army. Gideon throws the Midianites out of Israel, and he and his army have no weapons. They have lanterns, and they make noise on pitchers. It's vibration. So that's what we need. That's why the shift in consciousness could be much more powerful than.
And maybe that's what the bad guys in Mr. Global are all afraid of. You talk about things like chemtrails. I don't know. Maybe it's to keep us from working together.
Oh, I think if you look at the entrainment technology, my favorite Solari report is one I did with a scientist on entrainment technology and subliminal programming. It's an application to financial mechanisms. But I think part of the whole smartphone phenomenon is they're trying to get everybody to resonate with the machine instead of the divine intelligence in each other.
That makes perfect sense. That's their total mindset.
Right.
That's what they're always doing. That's what they're always doing. Okay, well, why don't we call it a wrap here, Catherine? We really appreciate you coming, and we recommend that people go to your website, Solari.com, and check out all that you're subscribers can get.
Okay, well, thank you for building the free and inspired space. I really appreciate it.
Okay, folks, it's a wrap. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for being the person you are, Catherine.
Thank
I really
you. Have a great day.
Okay,
Thanks.
bye-bye.